Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello. In this podcast, Susan and I discuss a patient of mine who had persistent wrist pain, and it was going on for quite some time, and it got exacerbated when she did a down dog in yoga, which makes sense. Full weight bearing on the wrist. You would think that a person who had wrist pain would have problems in that posture. But the source actually really wasn't her wrist. And this podcast really shows the beauty of looking at the activity that makes your patient hurt. And it really validates why they come into your office. Hope you enjoy it. And once again, Susan and I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for listening to the podcast. And if you have not done so already, please give us a review on iTunes. We would really appreciate it. All right, enjoy, guys. Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome back to Tough to Treat. We both hope you've been enjoying the podcast, and this week I decided, because it's my turn to talk about an interesting patient of mine, to do an actual peripheral joint. And I know that we've been focusing a lot on the lumbar and the pelvis and the neck, and I had my patient with my golfer guy with the knee, and I've had some patients with foot issues, and we treat the whole body at the end of the day. But I thought this patient who I've been treating her for different things, and she happened to come back for a wrist issue. So I figured we'll get started, and you can see how her journey went. And so she is an artist, actually a sculptor, works with her hands. And as you can imagine, having a wrist injury for me, my nervous system would go through the roof. I had a wrist injury. So she was lifting a heavy box. So she works part-time for some galleries here in New York, and then her really main gig, or her side hustle really, is sculpting. So she's lifting a heavy box at work, and she felt her wrist sort of go. She said she heard a pop, a little bit sore. She's generally of the hypermobile nature, and she went to see a physician who put her in a splint, which is smart. I mean, just protected for a while. So when I saw her, she was probably 2 weeks post splint. I think she was still wearing the splint, but it was post injury. So her chief complaint was, right wrist pain, decreased wrist extension, couldn't lift heavy objects, couldn't grip, and her recreational history consisted of rock climbing, if you can only imagine, indoors here in New York. Wow. And Pilates and yoga. So she's very much into the whole, alternative, integrative type body assessment, and did a lot to help her health. So her main issue was that she couldn't do a down dog. And I was like, that's it. And she's like, well, I can't really extend my wrist, but obviously when you go into down dog, you need almost complete full wrist extension. And that was her issue. She has had a history of other injuries, which I've treated, primarily neck, as well as the opposite wrist, which I treated probably a couple of years prior. I guess the nature of her her occupation, she uses her hands. She does rock climbing, Pilates. I mean, she does a lot of weight bearing stuff, so she's going to have some issues. And her other wrist healed very quickly. And so this one, I think she wasn't doing as much yoga the prior time, but this one she's doing a lot of yoga, and so she couldn't do the down dog. So do you see, I mean, I think at the end of the day, therapists, we always say, oh, we don't see a lot of wrists or elbows, but we actually do, because we treat the whole body. And in her case, right, Susan, isn't that what you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, if you're doing anything with the trunk, you're looking at the extensions off of the trunk, which are the legs and the arms. And I think how people actually kind of hold and position themselves with their peripheral joints has a lot to do. We don't think about it as much because with some of the cases we've talked about, maybe the knee or the foot was one of the big drivers, to get in and kind of as a big contributor to somebody's dysfunction. And, we don't really think about the arms being weight bearing.
Right.
But in this case, here's somebody who actually uses their arms as their, as a brachiator, because she's climbing, and she uses it as weight bearing and under compression with Pilates and yoga. So now it becomes a different kind of input into the system, rather than somebody who sits and just types and lifts her purse and, pushes doors open. She's really handling body weight in a lot of different positions around her arms.
Yeah. And, people always say, oh, well, she, has decreased wrist extension. We need to mobilize the wrist. Yeah, maybe, but her main issue, she couldn't do a down dog. Down dog is a fully loaded, weight-bearing, closed chain movement. And for her, that was her thing. She didn't really care if she, couldn't extend her wrist that much. It was when she put weight through it. And I do agree with you. I think ultimately in the end, once again, I'm going to repeat this ad nauseum, we're a movement profession. And if someone comes in and can't do a down dog because their wrist hurts, it's up to us to look at the whole body and figure out, why can't she do that? Is it her wrist? Maybe. It wasn't. But obvious, which is why I brought it up today. So it's never the obvious in our patients.
Right. What are they doing with everything else? Why is this happening like this? Yes.
I know. So people always say, oh, elbow, wrist, we don't like to do them. Yes, okay. But ultimately, when you see patients like this, it's our duty to treat these patients because we need to look at the whole body. So I'll get off my soapbox. So basically, I looked at her. She had no prior medical history except the other injuries that I've mentioned. Young, I think she's probably in her early 30s. Not married, things, just no children, etc. So, but she is very hypermobile, runs in her family. I treat her, other members of her family. So she did a down dog. And all of a sudden, I see most of her weight on her right side. I was like, what's up with that? You would think she would do the opposite, right?
Right, push off of it.
Right, and she is right-handed as well. I forgot to mention that.
Okay, so
yes,
dominant.
Yes, correct. So I looked at it and I said, why are you putting all the weight on your right side? Oh, I didn't know that. I was like, well, you kind of need to. So I had her do it a few times, and then I had her do it against the wall just to be it in a little bit of an unloaded position. I had her do it on the plinth. And then I went back down, and I saw the same thing. She was shifted to the right. And then I actually had her go down, full down dog, really low to get the hips up in the air. And I went in and I really put my hands on her shoulders because I'm using my hands here, but if you can imagine someone in a fully loaded down dog, even though her hands were in the same point in space, her right shoulder was, if you can imagine, if you're thinking like Shirley Sarman, was anterior and it was internally rotated. Her shoulder girdle was in a twist to the left. And I'm like, what's up with that? I mean, she's right-hand dominant. She probably has tightness, right?
A twist to the left and a lean to the right.
Yes.
So the shoulder itself was internally rotating, but she was deviating over that situation. Interesting.
Correct. And I said, well, maybe it's just she's got tight pecs. I'm just thinking without even touching. Maybe she's just got some tight muscles. So what I did was, I pointed this out to her, and she has really good body awareness. Before I even got my hands on her, I said, can you just, I took a picture. And so I said, do you see your right hand's, even though your hands are sort of in the same plane, your shoulder girdle is in a twist, for lack of a better word, to the left. I said, can you try to change that? And she's like, oh, okay. And I said, you're weight bearing on that right side. So she did it again. She was able to equalize the weight, but she still could not untwist her shoulder, or she could not get that shoulder back. So I went in with my hands and I manually did it. Okay, that's what I did. I put my hands in there. I said, so I had to do some deep breathing. I said, I need to get in there. It's a strong pull. I need to get my hands under your pecs, in your axilla, and just pull your shoulder girdle back. And I said, take some deep breaths and let me in there. And she did. So I got her back. And I said, can you hold this? And she's like, yeah, I can hold this. And she's like, my wrist doesn't hurt anymore. And I'm like, okay, there you go.
Wow.
So, because I think what was happening is she had, and I don't know why she was twisted. I mean, I don't like to use that word, but it was just not appropriate for a down dog, a repetitive down dog for her. So,
well, because she was having symptoms.
Correct.
If they're not having symptoms, and they're okay, we're not probably even going to be talking to them about that. But she was having symptoms. I mean, real symptoms. And you have to kind of look up the chain, as we've talked about before. And, where is the trunk positioned and how is it positioned? And if we make a change to that movement pattern and their symptoms change, then boom, there you are.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And she had symptoms initially. And I agree with you. Some people do that down dog all day long and they're fine. And who cares, and move on, right? So with her, it was meaningful to her. So she was able to correct it. And I said, are you feeling any pulls? Are you feeling any resistance to this movement? She's like, yes, I'm feeling it in the front of my shoulder. And I said, okay, obviously it could be some muscular tension, pec minor. It could be some neural congestion up there. It could be joint issue, which I doubt. She's so hypermobile. At the end of the day, I think it was a control thing with her. So I got her on this. So I said, okay.
Oh, she was hypermobile too. That would make sense.
Yes, and I looked at her.
Interesting that she picked Pilates and
yoga,
rock climbing and
rock
stuff
climbing.
And yoga. Yeah, because those are things that are going to help her kind of like pull it together.
Yes, and yeah, so it's funny because she was able to correct it, but not hold it. So I looked at her pelvis. I just took a brief look. I looked at, her feet, her calves, making sure that nothing else was crazy. But I made such a change so quickly. I was like, you know what? Okay, get on the table. So I ended up just doing a quick assessment of the wrist, just because I had to, because she did have a direct injury there. And it was a bit limited, but what was really interesting, she's lying on the table, Susan, with same thing, just obviously right dominant, the right shoulder is going to be a little anterior, normal for people who use their right hand, okay?
Right.
Normal. So I suggest, and this is wild, I'd love to get your feedback on this. So I suggest, put your hand out, extend your wrist. And it was limited, it was a bit sore. And I said, let's just correct your shoulder. Let's modify your shoulder position and see if we can make a change. So I gently, just same thing, got under the axle, just brought her shoulder back into more of a, I hate to say posterior glide, but I basically just took the twist out of her system, okay, for lack of a better word. And I said, just show me your wrist extension. And do you know, it was full and it was pain-free. And I'm like, what is up with that?
Wow. Do you think we had a little neural tension stuff going on with that?
Well, yes. Right, because she looks at me and I'm like, oh, shit.
So interesting. This is so interesting. This is a phenomenon that I've seen a lot in post-radiation and post-surgical breast cancer patients, that the pec gets adhered down so hard, oftentimes, that the shoulder is really pulled into, some different positions. And some people can cope with it quite well, and other people just cannot. And one of the things that I've always done was go after that neural tension by doing exactly what you did. I'm just like laughing here listening to your story, because it's like, she's going to put her thumbs and lift that pec up, isn't she? and then that's kind of one of the things that I've done, that soft tissue kind of just lifting, rolling, mobilizing, and then seeing what happens down the arm and what happens at the neck.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes you might see people like that and their neck is stiff, or they're having, pain, and you go in and can work with the shoulder and changes the neck. We know that regional interdependence, right?
Yes.
I love it though, because it just like ding, 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 ding. There's the neural tension.
Right. And I said to myself, this is obviously open chain versus closed chain, but, and I know her nervous system. She is the less is more. She responds very well to this kind of stuff. So I ended up, she's like looking at me like, oh, geez, and I said, well, it's obvious this is where your driver is, your source, or locally, right? At the end of the day, it's about your nervous system and how you can make a change very quickly. I said, so what I ended up doing to start with, I kind of like to get my hands in there and see how easy it is to get into the pec, or to correct the shoulder girdle torsion. And it was not easy on her, to be honest. So I know you're talk so much about breathing. Because the pec minor is an inspiratory muscle, correct? Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's the pec major under stress.
Right. So I got my thumbs in there. I'm actually doing it on my body right now. And I had her just do some breathing, and just, upper apical breaths and lateral costal breaths, and just anything that I can so her nervous system would calm down, so I could get in there and just do a few minutes, right, of soft tissue work. And I'm doing a lot more breath work now that we started this podcast, because I find it's just so helpful for patients.
It's primal.
Exactly. And she this was probably a while ago I did this, but I will tell you, it was very helpful for her. So I went in there, I did a little bit of soft tissue work, a little, I don't even like to say joint mobilization. I was just doing whatever I do to affect her nervous system because she didn't have a stiff glenohumeral joint. So, because she is hypermobile. But what was interesting, I ended up checking just for the heck of it, in the supine position at 90 degrees of abduction, her internal rotation. I don't know why I did it. I looked in my chart. I did for some reason.
Yep.
And it was significantly limited. And I have no idea why. And I didn't really go there. I just used it as a little test for myself to see if it got better after my intervention. So what I started to do, because she was lying on the table, I ended up doing all these nerve glides, so I've got my hand in her pec minor. I've got in the position, I'm just basically I'm doing like median nerve, radial nerve, any kind of movement that will help her extend her wrist, kind of sliders and tensioners for people who are listening. I love this David Butler things that we've learned in school and in many courses, median nerve glides, radial, but I was doing it she was doing it on her own while I was actually in there trying to free up some of the tissue. And, I call that nerve glides with movement. I don't know what I call that.
No, it's
in my charts, but
nerve glides by Erica. I mean, you're just it's like Corey Blinkenstoff talks about, finding the edge, like moving around where you can move okay and not going into where you can't. And that's what you're doing, is kind of like just the dance of the nerves there. Like, okay, we can go all right this way. We can go, oh, not that way. We'll move around this way. I think it's fantastic. It just dawns on me while I'm sitting here listening to this that, we've talked a lot about somebody who has a lot of mobility. And sometimes you have to wind up the nervous system in other places to get to it. Obviously on her you didn't, because it was clear where it was really kind of happening. But what is so interesting is she wasn't having symptoms doing other stuff. But when she got into downward dog, so if you think about downward dog and you think about that laying them on the back, that their legs are both coming up. So what she's doing in downward dog is tensioning her nervous system through the legs and the feet all the way down. And then, wow, bazoonga, as Sheldon would say on The Big Bang Theory, then boom, then it brought it on. So that's kind of interesting. I love how that together matches with that, because I wasn't thinking that at all. I was thinking, as a PT, I'm thinking, well, why are you having pain there with compression?
Yes.
Maybe your little carpal bones are getting mushed. Well, they were getting mushed, but for a different reason.
Yeah.
Maybe because of the lack of movement or gliding, but because of the tensioning she was putting through her, that's the whole system.
Wow. That's great. It's funny looking back on it. Absolutely, her nervous system was so wound up, and I did not do this, but now that we're talking about this, I almost would have loved to have done her like down dog against the wall and just do knee flexion, knee extension, up on her toes, just mobilizing the lower quarter of, of her lower other parts of her nervous system. And I would now that I would do that now. Okay. But I did not back then.
Well, that's okay. I mean, we're just kind of rethinking through some different things, but I love the way that you picked up on the, nerve glides in the peripheral nervous system and, the whole bit. And it wasn't that what she was doing with her shoulder was wrong, like you said. It's just that it was such a pattern that the rest of her body was compensating around.
Yes.
And she was actually having symptoms because of it. And once you begin to change the pattern, you're on the right track if the symptoms change. If they stay the same, don't just keep, messing around there, but try to figure out a different way for her to get in a position that is going to make it better for her, because she really wants to do this apparently, or she would be in your office going, I can't do this.
Yeah, she's highly motivated. But it's interesting because I don't know who I was talking to. People say, well, did she have a nerve issue? I'm like, no. Did she have like a radial peripheral nerve injury? No. But these is all about mobilizing the nervous system. And I think people sometimes shy away from doing these nerve glides because they say, oh, well, there's no radial nerve injury. doesn't have to be a radial nerve
Right.
injury. There's congestion in the nervous system. You can do slumps. You can do straight leg raises. You can make it up. Just get them moving in tensioning their system or in some way, shape, or form, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's I think sometimes it just bothers me when people say, you should have a nerve injury. You don't have to do that. I'm like, well, yes, I can, and I can do what I want, because
But you had with clinical reasoning, we talk
obviously.
about you had clinical reasoning to do this because when you like lifted and took some tension out of the system, her wrist extension improved. So she
Right.
had a change of
Yes.
movement right away.
Right.
And it
Right.
wasn't where you were doing it, it was down the chain, which was very
Correct.
interesting.
Yes.
But the idea is that she wasn't having these symptoms, and there's weight bearing in Pilates.
Absolutely.
And she's brachiating and rock climbing. So there is gripping and holding,
Mm-hmm.
and she wasn't being stopped from doing that.
No.
So whatever, it was just this particular position, and looking at the whole system kind of now she might have progressed to problems in Pilates and rock climbing, but she sounds like she was very astute in saying, I got pain, that's a call to action, I need to nip this in the bud, which is great, because usually I would get the person who is a year down the road and it started with downward dog, and then it would be with Pilates, and then with rock climbing and everything else, and it'd be a bit of a bigger mess.
Yes.
But this is the idea, is like really taking a look at that system and doing that clinical reasoning and going, what's happening here, and what happens if I intervene and start doing, because you constantly were looking, you're like, okay, I did this, what happened to the wrist extension? Did it stay the same? Did it get better? Did it get worse? And that's where we have to head oftentimes.
And it's a matter, it is clinical reasoning, and it's just a matter of obviously experience and seeing clinical patterns and knowing your patient. And with her, when I corrected her shoulder, I'm up in that whole brachial plexus area. There's got to be congestion, so which is why I had her do the various nerve glides. That's the clinical reasoning. Then what I also had her do is I had her do like a median nerve glide with her right hand in supine, hook lying, knees bent, and then I had her drop her knees to the left to tension the whole system.
Love it.
And then we came, knees came back, and then she brought the arm back. So
closed chain nerve glides.
Right. Just moving the system. My explanation to her, because she gets it, I said, there's just some congestion up here in the shoulder area, and we need just to decongest it, to be honest, and it will clearly resolve, and you need to move. You need to basically move and clear the whole system up. And with her, it was really more about understanding why her shoulder was that way. And I said, it's your right hand dominant. I mean, it's not unusual. No one's perfectly symmetrical.
It could be a pattern you picked up somewhere, and it just kind of hung in there as a little bit more dominant than you really need it to be.
Yes, and with her, I explain, your wrist really isn't that stiff. It's not stiff. If I can make a change with correcting your shoulder and get increased wrist extension, you don't have a stiff joint. Okay, it's a control. There's something else going on. So we ended up doing a lot of that, just nerve glides, a la Erica, and I think as therapists we tend to sort of stick to certain things, but I think that we can be creative with our patients, because the person in front of you is a dynamic human being.
Yeah.
They're not going to respond similarly to the next person, and you just need to find the sweet spot. And with her, that was her sweet spot. So we did a lot of that. I did a lot of breath work. Since she does Pilates, now I'm not a Pilates instructor, but I have done it over the years. So I gave her, for people who are out there who do Pilates with their patients, what I ended up doing with her is I put, because we have the Cadillac and Reformer in the gym, so I had her get on the big Cadillac and hold on to the what do you call that, the bar that drops down, and almost do like a roll down, but I had her take her right hand out. So she's in a seated posture, legs straight, feet up against the bar, left hand on the bar with springs. I had her do a roll down and then do some nerve glides as she did a roll down. And then I had her do both sides, actually holding on with the right and doing the same with the left. I think they call it mermaid in Pilates. I'm not exactly sure. but I had
I
her.
would call it nerve glides in
Yes,
the
you're
seated
right.
position. So when you were
Exactly.
talking about doing downward dog up against the wall and bending the knees, you were right there. You didn't have the time to get to the other. You were
I
already
know.
doing all these other great ones, but
I
that's
know.
exactly what that is.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Mobilizing the nervous system to gain movement and
Yeah.
ability and motor control.
Yep. So she did a lot of that, just seated roll downs, mobilizing the nerve. Then I had her, which I think is kind of interesting. So what did I have her do? I had her go on her back on the Cadillac. So there's another long bar where you put your feet up against the bar and you push up like you're doing a reverse crunch almost. I'm not exactly sure what that's called in Pilates, but anyway, it was almost mimicking the down dog, but inverted, right? So
Right.
I had her do that, and I had her, so she's fully supine, legs straight up, hip flexion 90 degrees, feet against the bar in dorsiflexion, almost like a slump, except her head wasn't off the table.
Right.
And then I had her push up with her heels and just do things with her arms on the table.
Exactly. I love it because that's winding up the lower part of the system so that you can begin to tension even greater the upper part of the system.
Yes.
And especially on people who are super flexible.
Yes.
Which is probably why that didn't come on when she was doing some of her other stuff, because she wasn't winding it up enough, but downward dog wound her up enough that would bring on the symptoms. And so I love the way that you were kind of getting her in these positions to get that, the lower quarter wound up.
Yeah.
And, have her do the nerve glides and the movements and the things. And that she's doing it around apparatuses that she's used to. So the average Joe isn't going to come in and, they may do it with you, but they're not going to go to Pilates and do that. Because they're not going to Pilates, but she is. And so now you're giving her like, here, when you do this, add this little piece in so you can keep that going. And she's got access to that. And, she'll be all in for that. And, it's meaningful.
Yes, it is. And we did a couple of, so I had her do that, and then I had her just do some things on the, as well as the Cadillac, because we were sitting there, and I had her they have leg springs. I had her do some leg springs, keeping her arms still, and then it was almost like just dropping one leg, move, almost like the dead bug, but more of like with, extend the wrist and alternate and feet, but just move, but use the meaningful, the arm movement that is quote unquote your issue, as opposed to just keeping it in a symmetrical plane like sagittal plane flexion extension. I had her do more transverse plane. I had her do rotation, her internal rotation that was quote unquote limited that I checked. I had her do that. I had her reach. So I did a lot of that, just basic movement patterns. And I think that's the creative part, because it was a very specific movement with her. So, and she did, then I sent her off at home to do that on her own, and to basically work with her Pilates instructor. What I had her do at home was the things I did on the table: nerve glides with lower extremity, lower trunk rotation, bilaterally, and doing some heel slides with the arms out, things like that. And then I said, for the heck of it, let's just check your internal shoulder rotation, because we didn't do anything. I just happened to check it, and do it was pretty full after that. And I was like, great. dang, I don't know why I checked it. I know, isn't it? And
that's when you can say that it's just the aha moment, not only for you but for the client, that the locus of control is in you. I'm just facilitating the movement here. Some soft tissue work, some breath work. We've got all these avenues to go in, but you have the power to change this. And did you have to stretch? No. Did I have to jump up and down on your wrists? Not really. No. So let's see where it got. That's kind of that great, like, ooh, look at the change you made. So that she walks out feeling very empowered. Like, oh, if I do these things, I'm going to have this change because I had it there.
Yep. And with her, I think, since she is so hypermobile, yoga's fine for her, but she really probably does Pilates a little bit more consistently. And what I've noticed is that with her, because I did do soft tissue work. I did. I had to. It was just gripping in there, and I had to get in there, and that's fine. And I do that fairly frequently. But with her, it was actually necessary, because it was just, she had this neural holding pattern for some reason.
Yep,
And
her brain was protecting something for some reason.
correct, correct.
And there it is. Could have been a dominant pattern, could have been something ancient that never really got,
Hmm.
that just kind of kept getting wound up into it. Who knows? I mean, there's no way to go back and, travel through time and
Hmm.
go, oh, it was right there when you were 10,
Right.
We
Exactly.
don't know. We don't get
Exactly.
to know that. We just get to kind of help the system find a new way.
Yeah. And she did ask me about the splint, and because I know people may ask about that. I mean,
Hmm.
she was wearing it for a fairly long time. And I said, look, I asked her how long did the physician want her to wear it. She's like, well, he said, until I feel good, or until, no specific time frame. So I said, when do you like, do you wear it at night? She said, yes. And I said, well, she goes, because it was bothering me in the morning. I said, well, at night, you're not really aware of what you're doing with your wrist. I said, you certainly can wear it at night. And I don't know if you need it during the day, unless you're going to start to lift heavy again. You may want to just protect it a bit longer, but I left it up to her because I don't like to, I mean, she didn't have a fracture. She didn't have any ligament. I mean, it was
Right,
not, it was more of
right.
a, do I need to still wear it versus
Hmm.
do I have to still,
Right, right.
so I'm of the opinion, well, you can if you want, but I don't necessarily think you need it. But if you have to lift something at work heavy, you may want to throw it on for that
Hmm.
little bit of time, but it's not like this girl's going to stiffen up. Trust me, she was not
Hmm.
stiff, and she could wear a splint for a month and she wouldn't be stiff. So it was just
Hmm.
really more of a psychological thing.
Yeah,
But
kind of
for
like
me,
she probably thought if I wear it, then I'll remember to protect myself.
correct,
You
correct.
know,
Yeah,
so and sometimes the belief is that it makes it better that I'm
yeah,
resting and immobilizing. People have, that's kind of part of our culture is you have an acute injury, we wrap it and we protect it.
yeah,
And there's something to that. You got to heal. Whether she had an injury and it may not have been what's being associated with her pain now, as far as what she actually did to her wrist, it sounds like that healed. Perhaps the nervous system got sensitive.
yes,
And then she had this other thing. The contributions to the system, to me, to the whole experience is just amazing that you can look at all those pieces. But I agree with you. It's kind of like, splints are funny, like people are wearing boots for way longer than I think they should.
hmm,
But, I am not them. What I need to convince them or convince them to understand is that perhaps it's okay for them to start to let go of that need for protection as much. I think
yes.
David Butler said it more beautifully than anything as a story he told about um, a friend of his wife, had been, had some, I can't remember the whole story, but basically she was in a boot way long, and just couldn't get out of it and was starting to suffer, like not going out, not doing things, because of this foot and this boot and this thing, and so David worked with her and did some stuff, and she was walking around without her boot, and his friend looked at him and he said, "You got her to fall in love with her leg again."
Aw,
Oh, it was just like such a David Butler story, but
I love it.
it's just like, and sometimes I think, it's like give her permission to, like, it's okay. You can accept that risk back into your life again the
Yep.
way it is. It doesn't have to always be like the guarded, protected one, you
Yeah.
know.
It's funny because
But you gave it to her on her own terms, which I
right,
love, rather than now, get rid of the thing. You don't need it. And then all of a
right.
sudden she's like, oh,
I know. I know. I don't like to make decisions like that for patients unless it's like I'm adamant about something. But
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think that they're like there for a reason. And it contrasts this, for example, she's hypermobile. She sprained her wrist. Contrast this with someone who actually fractured their wrist and
Yeah.
is immobilized and had surgery. Yeah, you need to mobilize that joint a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a stiff joint, right? And they may have the same symptoms and the
Right.
same issue, but there's going to be two different treatments. And
Right.
that's clinical reasoning. Maybe you do obviously have to treat the wrist in the wrist fracture if it's stiff. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you may need to do a little bit of nervous, neural
Nerve
glides,
glides and
nerve
movements
glides
and
and
other
movement
things.
patterns because it's going to be a compensatory issue at that point. But this contrast with the fact that just because someone has wrist pain doesn't mean that you need to sit there and mobilize their joint. Clearly, with her history and just by looking at her and just looking at her wrist, it was not limited. However, her big thing is my wrist feels stiff and it's sore when I go into down dog. Stiff for a hypermobile patient is not stiff for a normal patient,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
And I think the stiffness that they're feeling is not general stiffness as in the sarcomeres are shortened,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So I do believe in doing things like that directly to the wrist, but in her case, it would have made her worse. I got to be honest. It would have made her far worse if I sat
Mm-hmm.
there and stretched and mobilized. No way. That would have really done her in. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think the moral of this little this little story is that, obviously you have a thorough clinical reasoning process, but you look at the thing that makes them hurt and be open to doing other things that, even though there's no direct nerve injury, doesn't preclude you from using your brain and doing some of these things,
Right.
because these are important. And David Butler has a really interesting video on YouTube. It's called, like, I think Centrocord, or like as in CENTRE, and he's with a patient, and it's for elbow pain, but he's in his classic orange pants and green shirt, and he's
Uh-huh.
he's helping her dance and do dance movements with
Yeah.
mobilizing her nerves. And I think even if you that's a great thing to do whether you have pain or not. It just gets you
Yeah. Keeps you
moving, right?
moving. Yeah.
Yes.
Keeps things mobile. The nerves need to move.
Yeah.
That's how
So
they
with
stay healthy.
with her, I saw her for, I don't know, 2 or 3 visits, and we did pretty much. I didn't need to progress anything. We did pretty much the same. Just had fun. I had fun with her. I really did, and I've known her for
Mm-hmm.
a while. So we did different things on the Pilates equipment. I actually had her get on there's a Wanda box that almost
Mm-hmm.
mimics down dog. I had her put her hands right on there and put her feet on the springboard and see if she could lift her legs up and weight bear on her hands. And she was able to do that. And that's heavily loaded. That's actually harder than a down dog. But we progressed to that. And she was good to go. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the story.
That's great. So that's a great story about, like, looking at the upper extremity in a different way, because we
Mhm.
think of it, in performing arts as more of the gesture, but in performing arts, there's a lot of weight bearing into the upper extremity.
Yeah.
Same with, other types of performance, even including lifting.
Yeah.
It's backwards, but it's still closed chain when you've got a heavy bar and you're pressing. But the interesting thing, like I said, is that she's doing a lot of activities that speak to her, because it probably just helps her feel strong,
Yeah.
and that's great, because I think that a lot of people who have a lot of mobility self-select into activities where a lot of mobility is required,
Yeah.
without actually making sure that they cross-train into the things that can help hold them, feel a little bit more pulled together too.
Yeah. Which is
And
why I
so,
love the rock climbing for her.
yeah, I do too, because it's kind of feeding both beasts for her. You have
Hmm.
to be a little flexible to reach over and grab those elusive, holds, but you
Hmm.
have to have some power and control to be able to not fall off the wall too. So
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
kind of cool.
Yep.
Very cool.
Yeah. So she's good, and I just enjoy treating patients like that. I think it's fascinating, and I think that if the patient has an open mind, which really was helpful in this case, to
Hmm.
be honest, because some people are like, why are you treating my shoulder when my wrist hurts?
Yeah. Right.
And you have to explain to them. And I think if you get that buy-in,
Hmm.
you can pretty much tell those people right out of the box the first session. And I knew her before, so I was able to play around. But if someone comes in and they're like, well, it's my wrist that hurts, and you can get the buy-in by making a change immediately, that's half the problem, or that's
Yeah.
half the battle, right?
Right.
So
Exactly. Love it.
love it. Anyway, that's it for me.
Okay.
Cool. Thank
So,
you.
yep, that's going to conclude the podcast. Thank you very much for listening. And if you like it, leave us a comment. If you have questions, leave us a comment, or, head over to iTunes and send us a review. We'd really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.